Let me start with the Honourable Minister. Uh, Give me some sense of the reasons why, the practical reasons why it was so hard to build back better after Erica and before Maria. What was in the way? What made that so difficult to do that perhaps now we can address and fix this time round?
I think the challenge is that you face a variety of different issues. The topography of the island of Dominica is such that it makes it very difficult to build infrastructure that is resilient. We are very mountainous, and we have a high degree of rainfall. And we also have 365 rivers, we say, one for every day of the year. Now, these things, when it rains, you have these rivers become raging monsters, and massive flooding takes place. Of course, you have lots of landslides as well. So it requires there to be significant expert advice on what is the best way of building infrastructure that can be resilient to those challenges. After Tropical Storm Erica, government decided that we would build back better. And in fact, some of the infrastructure that was built then took into account that principle and stood up very well to Hurricane Maria. So the bridges that were built higher. They were built with a longer span. And therefore, when the rivers became flooded, the water was able to pass under the bridge without affecting the bridge structure, and in ensuring that the abutments were not undermined. With the challenge of creating a climate resilient nation is to be able to address all of the different interventions that will be necessary. We have many communities that are very vulnerable because of their proximity to rivers and, in some instances, to the sea. And we would have to relocate some communities in order to make them safe. Just the sheer cost of having to implement interventions to protect those communities, it does not make financial sense to do so. And therefore, one has to look at relocating those communities. Now, we're dealing with an island of 70,000 people, where you have it's a small tax base, and we are also considered to be upper middle income countries, and therefore access to financing is very difficult. In order to build back better, you must build stronger. It's going to be more costly to do it. And where you have difficulty in accessing concessional financing and grants and so on, it makes it difficult for a small country to be able to do what is necessary to build back better, and also to be able to pay for the expert advice that is necessary, so that you design structures that can withstand hurricanes, and not only hurricanes, but earthquakes and other challenges. So essentially, you need to have that access to expert advice, and you need to have the financing in order to build back better and to build resilience. And there are many. You have the Green Climate Fund and other funds that have been designed for assisting with mitigation and adaptation to climate change. But many of us are unable to access it. And a lot of that is because the requirements to access the funding, we are not able to meet that requirement, but because just the documentation that has to be prepared in order for you to access the financing requires you to get experts to prepare it. And so there has to be a mechanism in place that makes it easier for the countries that really need to access that financing to be able to do so.
And there were one or two attempts in Bonn, in part with the leadership of the Fijian presidency, to grapple with those issues.
Right.
I don't know whether you feel encouraged by any of those that have emerged. I mean, the adaptation fund was replenished. There were this in-sea resilience initiatives that the Germans and the UK have funded. There are other initiatives to bring together expertise to help with insurance matters, but it's probably not the whole, probably doesn't solve all of your problems, but were you encouraged by that? Does that look more attractive?
The challenge that we have is that time is not on our side. In 5 months' time, we'll be going into another hurricane season. And unfortunately, we're told that it may be worse than the last. And therefore, we need access to the financing now to begin the projects, to begin to take the actions that are necessary. So yes, I'm encouraged that the word is getting out that we need to be able to have a better system of accessing the finance, but we still need to act more quickly than we're acting now, and we have to make the funds available in order that the countries that are affected by these hurricanes and can begin to adapt and mitigate the effects of those things by building the infrastructure and other things.
Very clear. Secretary General, I mean, it follows on from that. You know, where do you see opportunities for the international community to support highly vulnerable member states to build back better and therefore reduce risk in the future? What promising signs do you see? Perhaps there's some opportunity with CHOGM coming up to draw attention to this matter.
Well, I think one of the great things is to see that the things that we've already identified are exactly what countries are telling us they need. So, for instance, the Climate Finance Access Hub, which is going to give countries the acuity of understanding and expertise that they need to make the applications to get the money for the access that will build the adaptation and resilience needed is critical. But also there's an opportunity for us to pool our expertise on what sustainable buildings look like. So, for example, the Minister said so clearly some of the challenges that are created by the topography. Well, one of the big issues is building engineering difficulties that are presented by building buildings on a slope. A normal foundation in a usual house is encompasses about 15% of your build is going to be on the foundation. In a country such as Dominica, 55% is on the foundation. And that imbalance is an engineering challenge that we have. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us to pool our knowledge and expertise of what works and what doesn't work, and to share that capacity, because small countries cannot do it on their own, but the problems that are faced by the small countries are almost identical to the problems that are faced by the larger ones. It's just they don't have as much money. So the whole point of the Commonwealth's activity is to pool knowledge, experience and expertise to enable all our countries to take advantage of what is known. But there is a big opportunity as well as a big challenge.
I wonder if we could just take 2 or 3 questions from the floor for the Minister and the Secretary General before we turn to Ronald and John on the panel. Are there 2 or 3 questions that, and we have microphones too, so one here and one there. So start. Oops. Sorry, go there first and then we'll come here.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself, yeah.
My name is Edwin Laurent. I'm with the Ramphal Institute. I wanted to first of all thank the Honourable Minister and the Secretary General for the very informative presentations. Of course, given what has happened in Dominica, it's clear that the intensity of the hurricanes that strike regularly and apparently with increasing ferocity through the region, the loss that results, as has been mentioned in the case of Maria, over 200% of GDP in Dominica, means that there has to be some sort of external financial support in order to rebuild, because of course the country has lost its income generating capacity. Now, James, in your introduction you spoke about insurance, the insurance proposal from about 30 years ago. in a specific country, of course, having suffered that great loss, there's no internal solution, financial solution, that could support rebuilding, which suggests, therefore, that one needs a wider pool from which the risk could be borne. I do know that in the Caribbean there was an insurance facility. I don't think that has ever worked very well. But I wonder, if we are looking towards the future, whether this might not be an area in which there could be the greater attraction of international support for the development of that institution and the funding. Thank you.
Over here. Introduce yourself, please.
Nestor from the Cabinet Office. My question is for Francine. So next hurricane season is coming a lot sooner than we would like it to, but it's coming. And there will be other impactful events. And populations that have been affected in the past will be affected again. And it's going to be very hard for them to keep going. And psychologically, it's going to be quite devastating. Now, what specific efforts are you collectively trying to put forward to build that psychological resilience of the population, to say, how do we, given what's been thrown at us, keep going?
So, let's have one more, because those were great. We will have more time later, I promise you, because we've got a big Q&A session once we've had the two other speakers. I want to try and keep the time, but...
I'll be very quick. Karen Mayhill, the High Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda. I actually wanted to ask both ladies and for their assessment of how the regional mechanisms, SEDIMA, etc., how do you see them operating in these environments, and how can we strengthen them? Or if they're doing fantastically well, it's okay, but are there ways that we can strengthen them to be mobilized more effectively, more quickly when we have disasters? Because to wait for a boat to come from Britain or from a plane when Antigua's next door, for example, and not affected in a particular instance might be, we need to look at. So I wanted to ask you about regional strength in your assessments.
Feel free. I mean, let's start with the minister and we can work down, and if the chance I might help with the answer to the first question.
Okay. I want to touch on what the question that was asked by this gentleman here. I think that the population of Dominica has shown great resilience. Despite the tremendous loss that has been suffered, there has been a sort of fighting spirit that has developed. People have not lost hope. And what has happened, I think people have bought into the idea of making the country resilient. And so there has been a concerted effort to bring information to people about making their homes more resilient, so that when they're building back and repairing the damage that has been done to their homes, that they take into account the new building codes and they build a structure that is more resilient. And so numerous seminars have been taking place, numerous discussions have been taking place with building contractors. Information has been going out there into the public to how do you make your roof stronger so that the next hurricane is less likely to blow it away. And so that sort of discussion has been taking place. The fact is that in the Caribbean, we don't have much of a choice. We know that these storms will come. The most that we can do is to try to be as prepared as possible for them. And we believe that there has been a strong showing of support from the international community and a willingness to assist us with our goal of making Dominica more resilient. We have made it very clear to people about this new agency that we're creating that has the support and the backing of the donors. We believe that that agency will be able to develop the projects and execute our projects much more quickly than we've been able to in the past because of lack of capacity. And so, whereas not much can be done before the next hurricane season. We're hoping that we are not so unlucky to be hit by another major storm this year. And so we're hoping that in the interim, before such an event happens in Dominica again, that we will get many projects started. We will be able to build proper hurricane shelters. We will be able to build proper schools, and we'll be able to help people, provide support to people to rebuild their homes in a more resilient way, because many people are going to need that support, because many of their homes are either not insured or underinsured, and therefore they will need a lot of support to get their homes to become more resilient to these disasters. Just to touch on what the High Commissioner from Antigua and Barbuda asked in relation to our regional systems. Both CDMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and the Regional Security System, the RSS, were very instrumental in assisting us immediately after the storm, along, of course, with our other CARICOM nations and other partners. CDMA plays a very important role in the Caribbean, but of course, as with everything else, it is under-resourced, and it could do a lot more if it had more staff and it had more resources available to it. We have also found from a CARICOM or Caribbean perspective as well, I think there's a lot more that CDMA, organizations like CDMA and RSS, can be more helpful to the wider region. So, for example, it was a challenge to get assistance to the overseas territories, because you have to get the approvals in order to go in and help. So when Hurricane Irma, for example, passed, we wanted to help, but it was difficult for us to go in quickly to help, because we did not have agreements in place that would allow us to go in right away to begin to help. So these are some of the issues that we have to look at to ensure that as a region we can help ourselves, because we are right there. We don't have to wait for something to come from for help to come from the UK or for help to come from the Netherlands, when we are right there in the Caribbean and can provide that support to other islands. So these are one of the things that we need to look at.
A good point to follow up on, isn't it? A practical but also legal and political matter that needs to be resolved. Right. Secretary General, would you like to respond to any of those questions?
Well, particularly in relation to CDMA, I think CDMA needs to be really congratulated, because it's a model which I'd very much like to see replicated in other regions, because it's the ability to coordinate and to respond quickly. When we were talking to the agencies on the ground immediately after the disaster, it was clear that there were some legal impediments in the way. So, for example, the opportunity to get all the attorney generals to give the particular authorities, because there weren't legal instruments to allow people to respond quickly. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to do a wash-up about all the things that went right, but all the things that went wrong, so that before the next disaster happens, we can move out some of those legal impediments and put in place the protocols, which will mean a rapid response from our partners will be more easily done. And I'm hoping that some of the things we've created, like we've now created the Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform, which allows the 52 ministries of justice to get together and to collaborate. This may be one of the instruments that we can use to move those out of the way. But I also think that there needs to be some sort of mechanism that we operate together in a very practical way to create a disaster response mechanism toolkit, so that all of us know that when you press a button, exactly what's going to happen and how we can better assist each other. I think this terrible disaster is actually the most interesting case study, because in the past we were preparing for one Category 5 hurricane in a lifetime. There was one in 72. We had 3 within a very short time. We were preparing for one country to be assaulted in a region, not 9. And so if you look at what happened during this period, we had every complexity known to man. And I think we need to take that as a case study, disaggregate what happened so that we are able to better respond and be more resilient ourselves. And just to say, in terms of the spirit of the Caribbean, we saw the most terrible devastation, but I think I will never forget the overwhelming feeling of extraordinary pride in the people, because we forget the resilience of our people at our peril, because there were people in Dominica, in Barbuda, in Antigua saying they took everything from us. They took every material thing we possess, but they left us with the most precious thing, which is our lives. And they were determined to build back better. And faith actually played a huge part in that recovery, because people prayed. And that prayer and that belief in God was incredibly important to the majority of people who did well. And it's just a reality of the lives in the Caribbean.
Yes. I just want to respond briefly to the question about whether or not there is some requirement, need for an international mechanism to cope with the reality that countries that have had that much economic loss with no time to adapt their current economies obviously need external assistance, but how to make that something that is not a question of a donor nation providing an amount, but is more of a trigger for the release of something more approaching compensation. And this has been a problem area for the negotiations right from the beginning, when the Alliance of Small Island States first articulated the need for something. And what tends to happen is we have conversations about loss and damage that are never resolved, but they exert some kind of moral or political pressure on other mechanisms that can deal with some aspects of the need. And insurance is one of those parallel conversations, which is why we tried all those years ago to create an insurance mechanism that responded to the real world facts of sea level rise being the most reliable proxy or measurement of the rate of change in the environment, which in turn would pick up some of the other phenomena like warming oceans and increased hurricane activity, and then had a mechanism for taking payment into a pooled fund out of those countries that had high per capita emissions. Now, we were never able to win that. We never got that into the text. But some of the basic principles remain. And the understanding that there needs to be some kind of pooled fund that pays out in an accelerated, in a timely manner. Because I know from other countries, Fiji being an example the year before, it takes too long to get the payments out, and you can't restart your economy in those circumstances. That is an enterprise really worth working on, and some modest progress was made in Bonn in November, but needs to be maintained this year with the handover to Poland coming shortly.
There is, I should just add to that, there is an insurance facility for the Caribbean, but the size or the magnitude of the damage that is done, the payouts, although they're very quick, is not sufficient to address the issues.
No, we're talking about something much bigger, but we're also having to contemplate something which was true all the way back then, when we talked about this before we came in here, that many of the risks that we want to see insured are uninsurable because they are known, that sea level rise is a known inevitability and therefore is uninsurable. So you have to design systems that create a marketplace for the management of that risk that are in some sense artificial. They're constructs, but they're constructs for a purpose that the marketplace here in London could play in, but someone has to write the rules. And we haven't got there. But I strongly suggest that you and the rest of us keep thinking about it and keep exerting some pressure, because it's obviously necessary. So that's actually not a bad bridge to the next part of our of our session, which is our panel discussion, where we now turn, sadly, Ronald Jackson can't be with us, but he's with us via the screen, and Ronald is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which has already been referred to, and you previously served, Ronald, as the Director General of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica, and we're very pleased to have you here, and I know that Secretary General wanted to talk to you, and because you can do it remotely. And then we've also got Dr. John Twigg, who's the Principal Research Fellow here at ODI, and John's been working on these matters for 25 years or so, focused on disaster risk reduction and international development, and we're very pleased to have him on our panel. But we're going to start with you, Ronald, if you're ready, and we have a good line. We'll get you to contribute. So over to you.
Oh, I thought let me just say hello to all our distinguished panelists, speakers who spoke earlier, as well as your audience and those listening online. What I want to offer to the debate or to the discussions, I will start perhaps with this thought. I've heard about building back better, and I've been hearing about building back better for quite some time. It takes me back to Hurricane Gilbert back in Jamaica. I was a young teenager then, perhaps. And later in 2004, after Hurricane Ivan. And practicing in this field, I've often been frustrated that the term seems to be bandied about more as a sort of buzz phrase, but I struggled to really see the application of the term. And so as I listened, I reflected somewhat, and I thought to myself, one of the things we should really be talking about, and it is embodied in what Baroness Scotland said. It is embodied in some of the comments made by the Honourable Minister. But I think we need to look at this idea of not just building better, but building smarter, and also I've added maintain and adjust. And I put that there because, you know, even as we talk about climate change and we examine the whole issue around cost to address some of the requirements for building more robust infrastructure, it is always going to be fleeting if we're not pursuing a policy which is taking stock of the changes over longer time scale within our respective environment. And as I thought back to my own experience in Jamaica, I can point to successes in the past, in the 80s, in the 70s, in terms of approaches at the time, not called building back better, but approaches to building back in a much more effective way. But even those successes, which we should have continued but also improved upon, had inherent weaknesses in terms of the failure to prescribe or to enforce no-build zones that would prevent persons who moved out of areas of high risk from going, or new persons from inhabiting those areas were not pursued. So there are things we could learn, and things that you know, a lot of the lessons we're seeing today are not new. We've just not addressed them in a sort of programmatic way. And so I think the starting point has to be filling the requirements for effective management of risk. And what am I saying there? I think we have to look at the whole issue of the creating the enabling environment, policy, legislation, not necessarily creating new ones, but harmonization and enforcement, knowledge and practice, and addressing the issue of governance and leadership, and also provide incentives. A lot of what is going to be required in rebuilding and building back better is a long-term endeavor. It's not a half year, 1 year, 2 year. It is a multi-year, longer-term initiative. Hence the cost you're having to grapple with. There has to be a mix of incentives in there for people at the community level to invest in hurricane straps. throughout all of the disaster sites I visited, there were signature signs that we do know how to build better at the housing, in terms of our housing stock. A number of units, modest units, stood up, remained in place. Why? Why did that happen? What can we learn from that kind of construction? Is it that we had people who invested in very simple things, the appropriate design criteria, the application of building straps, the appropriate spacing of timber framing on the rooftops, the appropriate pitch of the units, appropriately fitting on the galvanized sheeting? So we can in fact build back better, but we have to provide the sort of carrot and the stick to get people to comply with the measures that are there. And that includes the private sector, because they will have to be a major partner in the journey around the sort of investment over longer term. But they have to comply with the requisite laws that are on the books. And until we realize that recovery and reconstruction planning does not start at the end of the adverse event, but that it is a process which requires knowing and understanding risk, and then understanding risk and vulnerability, and then developing the likely scenarios, costing those scenarios, and essentially designing the kind of plans that would have been pulled through the planning and development community, but also the requisite financing outline behind it. We're going to be struggling, and this is not new. I think the Japanese, if you look at the great earthquake, they were able to pull out a draw and pull out a plan for reconstructing the areas, because they knew those areas were at risk to a particular hazard, and they planned for that particular eventuality. And I think that is where we need to get. We need to use risk information, data, vulnerability studies, because we knew there were communities that were vulnerable and the state they were in. And so we have to move to that. We have to look at the appropriate application of enforcement of standards. They're already on the books. Are we enforcing them? We must also not shy away from the politics. And it's very important, because in our Caribbean community, politics do play a role. We should not shy away from it. We should recognize it, embrace it, and the recovery and reconstruction process must acknowledge that it exists and develop the sort of bipartisan avenues to navigate a successful outcome of the reconstruction and recovery process. Because in building back, there are going to be some winners, some losers, whether it is at the household level, but also politically. How do we navigate that so at the end of the day, the people win, countries win, and the economic prosperity programs are sustained? We have to look at the engagement of the communities in the process, not just after the event, but also in the understanding risk process, the design of the reconstruction solutions based on the scenarios so that they are there, because at the end of the day, if that is not done, then the tyranny of the expedient is what takes place. Governments come under tremendous pressure to provide restitution for the affected in the immediate days, and that can lead to a sort of break in our intent around achieving the building back better concept. And the private sector has to be involved. So the enabling environment for private sector investment in some of the very expensive areas of the Build Back Better has to also be jump started. It's an opportunity for us to look at our own economy and economic diversification going forward. One of the things that struck me as I listened to the conversations around climate and climate resilience, and I said to myself, one of the challenges facing the region is also the seismic and volcanic hazard. So it simply can't be about building a climate resilient Caribbean, but looking more at the language of a risk resilient Caribbean that factors in the issues related to climate, but the issues also related to the very thing that gives us our beauty in the region, but can also render us at risk from when they rupture. So I think we need to harmonize efforts at attaining risk resilience with our efforts to tackle the impact of climate and the impact of disaster risk, along with the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Why? Resources are limited, time is limited, and we don't want to, at the end of the day, create waste or frustrate. I think we need to look in our small island development states as how we bring these in line. They are all towards one common endeavor, which is the overarching prosperity of the region and the region's people. So I think that is something that we have to look at. And within the context of CARICOM and the CSME movement, I am one that struggles to come to grips with this view that we don't have capacity. We may not have capacity in one of our small islands, but if we look at the region as a collective, we can pull resources across other member states into supporting some of our sister and brother islands that may have capacity challenges, and truly bring to life the idea of CSME and what was proposed within the context of CARICOM and the Treaty of Chaguaramas. I will leave it there and offer my other comments to any other questions or the discussion as it goes on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald. So, John, I turn to you now. As an expert in community resilience, where do you see the opportunities for a more resilient recovery? Is anything happening in the Caribbean that is distinct or different from what you've seen in other places? What lessons are there to learn from the community resilience work that you've been a part of these years?
I think the first thing to recognise is that all the debate about Build Back Better takes place in a post-disaster context, which is probably the worst time to be thinking about building back better from one perspective, in that you've suffered enormous loss. So while it's very salient, it's in everyone's minds, it's actually very difficult to launch it. You're dealing with, well, disasters are by definition extreme events. Irma and Maria were particularly extreme events. When you're dealing with devastation on that scale, it's difficult to know. You know where you're starting from, but it's really hard to plan where you're going to get to. You can't blueprint that kind of process, because every context and every situation will be different. And the resources you have access to will vary. We've heard already about the difficulties in accessing certain kinds of resource and capacity for this. So there are recovery plans, and they look very good on paper, but to some extent it's a journey without a map, because you don't know what you're going to encounter upon the way.
And having listened to some very moving and affecting descriptions of the consequences on communities from these storms, are there any use of universal truths that need to be shared? I mean, I take your point absolutely about the variety and the fact that one has to understand the particulars of place. But what common themes can be shared amongst those who are affected about how to recover in the most effective way?
Well, I think one universal truth that isn't universally acknowledged is that actually communities are the main actors in their own recovery, certainly in disaster response. That's often invisible when you read. The media don't really cover it very well. International agencies don't really talk about it because they talk about their own interventions. And whether it's emergency response, where you often get spontaneous volunteering on a huge scale, or long-term recovery, rebuilding houses and so on, it's very often the majority of that work is done by communities rather than external assistance. And we don't understand those processes well enough and how we can support them.
But it's an interesting story to tell.
Yes.
I mean, in a sense, there's a communication opportunity, if you like, there to tell the story of those who revealed that resilience that the first question pointed to, and how.
And there are opportunities to support those processes more effectively, rather than running the show, but actually support it. I mean, Ronald talked about an enabling environment. You can have an enabling environment that supports self-recovery, for example.
Yes, that's a nice phrase. Yeah.